Thanks, Eileen. Welcome to today's session on PDF remediation, standards, tools, and testing. Like Eileen said, my name is Dave Kingsbury. I'm the Director of the Office of Deaf Services for the Missouri Department of Mental Health. I also oversee spoken language access for people with limited English proficiency, and I'm the department's web accessibility coordinator. If you're interested in learning more about what the Office of Deaf Services does at DMH, you're welcome to go to dmh.mo.gov/deaf services. So in today's session, we're going to be covering part 1, talking about legal and technical standards that apply to PDF accessibility. I'm also going to explain a little bit about the differences between document accessibility with PDFs versus Word documents, and why in most cases it's preferable to use PDFs for document accessibility. We're going to be talking about automated and manual testing, and I'm going to share some resources to help you follow up and learn a lot more about this topic. PDF accessibility is a very broad and deep topic, and today's session and the part 2 included is really just an introduction to the topic in some ways, and it's focusing on tools and processes, standards, tools, and processes, not so much on remediation techniques. You will see some remediation techniques as part of the demonstrations, and so you'll be able to learn some techniques as part of that, but the purpose of these sessions is really to provide more information on standards, tools, and processes. And then for more in-depth coverage of techniques, I'll refer you to additional resources. And then, like Eileen said, part 2 with the demonstrations is going to be Tuesday, June 6th from 2 to 3 p.m. So starting with legal and technical standards for PDF accessibility, we're going to talk about the Disabilities Assistance chapter of the Missouri Revised Statutes and how that leads to the state ICT standards. We're also going to talk about some federal requirements in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Titles 1, 2, and 3, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, as well as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that are often referred to as WCAG or WCAG. And then something that you might not be familiar with, even if you've heard of the WCAG standards, and that's the PDF/UA standards. So Missouri Revised Statutes 161.935 requires that state departments and agencies ensure that all uses of information and communication technologies, or ICT, are accessible to people with disabilities. This requires that the State Information Technology Services Division and Missouri Assistive Technology Council work together to adopt standards for accessibility that state departments and agencies are to use. And these are required to be in line with the Section 508 requirements that apply to federal agencies. So basically, we're taking the accessibility standards that federal agencies use for ICT, and we're applying those to state agencies here in Missouri. So that state ICT standard requires that state agencies ensure that uses of ICT are accessible to people with disabilities. That's the broad intent of it. Specifically, it implements the WCAG 2.0 standards at the A and AA levels of compliance. Now, the WCAG standards have 3 levels of compliance: level A, level AA, and level AAA. So for us at state agencies, AAA level compliance is optional, but in most cases we are required to comply with levels A and AA. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act applies to any recipients of federal financial assistance, whether that's the state or local agency or a private nonprofit, basically any entity that's a recipient of federal financial assistance. This prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, but we're not going to cover the requirements of Section 504 further, because if you comply with the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, in almost every case, that's going to mean you're also complying with Section 504. So Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I applies to employers with 15 or more employees. So this includes the entire state of Missouri government. Even if your agency or your particular piece of the state government were small enough to not have 15 employees, the state of Missouri government as a whole, or at least the executive branch as a whole, is considered a single employer. And so we're still going to be over that 15 employee threshold. So this requires reasonable accommodations for qualified individuals with disabilities, and qualified individuals refers to both applicants and employees who are qualified to do a particular job. Appropriate reasonable accommodations are determined individually, and that's based on an interactive process with the person with the disability. Now, Titles 2 and 3 of the Americans with Disabilities Act don't apply to employment, rather they apply to whatever is being offered to members of the general public. And there's no minimum employee requirement for this to apply. So Title II applies to public entities, which is basically state and local government, instrumentalities of government, and this even extends to contractors that are making services available on the behalf of government. So for example, at the Department of Mental Health, most of our community-based services are provided through contracts with community mental health centers or other providers. And when they provide services under DMH contracts, they're required to meet DMH's Title II requirements that apply to state and local government. Now, Title III of the ADA applies to public accommodations, which is essentially businesses and nonprofits that serve the general public. Both of these titles require equally effective communication with people with disabilities. And that means if communication that is as effective as the communication that we provide with people without disabilities. Now, the effective communication requirement includes a requirement to provide what are called auxiliary aids and services anytime that's needed for effective communication. Now, auxiliary aids and services can be lots of different things, but the key example we're going to be talking about today is accessible electronic and information technology. And so here the ADA does include a requirement for accessible ICT. It could also mean things like magnification software for people with low vision, or other effective methods of making visually delivered materials available to people who are blind or have low vision. Now, one thing that's not specifically mentioned in the ADA regulations in relation to accessible ICT, but it is required by the principles of the ADA, is that we're not just addressing visual accessibility for people who are blind or have low vision. Part of the reason for PDF accessibility and other applications of the WCAG standards is for people who have other types of disabilities. For example, a person who has Parkinson's or hand tremors for other medical reasons might not be able to use a mouse effectively. And so they may need to navigate a web page or a PDF document entirely by keyboard. And so PDF accessibility isn't just about visual accessibility, it's also about accessibility for keyboard navigation for people who need that due to a disability. Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act also has non-discrimination requirements. This applies to health programs or activities if any part of that program or activity receives federal financial assistance from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So in Missouri, this would apply to the Department of Health and Senior Services, the Department of Mental Health, the Department of Social Services. This also applies to most private healthcare entities if they accept Medicare or Medicaid payments or any other source of federal financial assistance. This requires that health programs or activities provided through ICT are accessible to individuals with disabilities. Now, the WCAG technical standards, like I mentioned earlier, conformance to levels A and AA or AA is legally required for Missouri state departments and agencies. Now, the ADA and Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, these federal laws don't specifically require conformance to WCAG standards, but the WCAG standards are often referenced in court orders and settlement agreements when somebody brings suit or files a complaint under the ADA, complaining that electronic information is not accessible to them. Now, when you look at the WCAG standards, there are a whole bunch of different standards. And when you read through those standards and the information on how to comply with them, you'll quickly notice that the context of the application that's being explained is websites. And so they're talking about websites, the way websites are coded, the way web content is designed, and things like that. And yet the principles behind those WCAG standards still apply to PDFs, even though the way the application is described is sometimes specific to websites. And so WCAG has a list of PDF techniques that take their standards and help people apply them to PDF documents. So there are 23 of those standards, and I'm going to briefly explain those to you. Standard 1 is applying text alternatives to images with the alt entry. And so a person who is blind or has low vision may not be able to visually perceive, interpret, and understand information that is presented visually as opposed to text that's machine readable. And these images or figures or graphics need to be tagged with appropriate alt text that includes a description that is functionally equivalent to what that image provides to sighted users. Standard 2 is the creation of bookmarks. Now, this relates to how people navigate the document. Some of these standards, I'm going to take a step back for a minute. Some of these standards apply to making individual pieces of content accessible to people with disabilities. And so is this image accessible because it has alt text? Or is this text machine readable and tagged appropriately so that it's accessible to people with disabilities? But there's also the issue of how do people with these disabilities navigate these documents to find the information they're looking for. When a user without disabilities navigates a document, we might use the table of contents, we might use headings, we might use different ways the information is visually laid out within pages or within the document to help us locate the information we need more quickly, so we don't have to read through the document in a linear way from the first page of the document until we find the information we're looking for. So just like we can use different visual cues within the document like that to help us save time and use that document more efficiently, there are a lot of ways that these documents need to be designed to allow users of assistive technology to navigate them efficiently as well, locate the information they're looking for quickly, and not have to have their assistive technology read through the entire document from the start until they find what they're looking for. So creating bookmarks is one way to do that. If it's a very short document, 1 or 2 pages, maybe that's not necessary. Not all of these standards or techniques are going to apply to every single PDF document. But again, creating bookmarks, especially for longer documents, can be important to efficient navigation. Standard 3, ensuring correct tab and reading order. Depending on how a document was developed in the original program that was used to develop it, sometimes the content comes into PDF in the incorrect order. It might visually be in the correct order, but when somebody moves through with keyboard navigation or with a screen reader reading it, it might jump around and present the information in an incorrect order. And that can be at least frustrating, if not disorienting, and very confusing for assistive technology users. So it's important to ensure that the information flows correctly for keyboard and screen reader navigation. Standard 4, hiding decorative images using the artifact tag. Decorative images can be used as part of a visual layout or just kind of decoration to provide visual appeal to the document, but it doesn't convey meaningful information to the users. And so again, when we think about users of assistive technology wanting to be able to navigate through the document efficiently, they don't need a line that provides a visual break between different sections of the document, described with alt text saying this is a line that separates the different sections of the document. Or if an image is just decorative, it doesn't serve any informational or content purpose that needs to be conveyed to them, then that can be artifacted. And when it's artifacted, the assistive technology knows to just skip over it, and it doesn't take up that person's time unnecessarily. Technique 5, indicating required form controls in PDF forms. If a PDF has forms, it's designed to collect information and allow the person to submit that information. Those forms need to be set up correctly for accessibility, and the form controls is a particular part of that. Then technique 6, using table elements for table markup. Tables is another really big issue. Tables need to be used for presenting table content and not for visual layout. When tables are used, the sighted users can easily look at a cell and trace the row or column to the row headers or column headers. But for users of assistive technology, they can't do that visually. And so those headers need to be programmatically associated with each individual cell, which means it's very important for tables to be tagged correctly in PDF documents for them to be accessible. If a PDF, then technique 7, if a PDF is scanned, what you're presenting wasn't originally developed digitally. That scanned PDF needs to have optical character recognition performed so that the text becomes machine readable, so that it's electronic text instead of just an image. And then in addition to that OCR, all of that text needs to be tagged appropriately, and these other standards need to be applied as well. Technique 8. Now, this is our first technique that's level AAA. And so, well, this is a best practice. It's not required for those of us who are state agencies. This is providing definitions for abbreviations via an E entry for a structure element. Basically, what this means is, typically when you use an abbreviation, the first time it's in the document, you spell out what it means, then you put that abbreviation in parentheses. And for sighted users, throughout the rest of the document, you continue to use that abbreviation instead of spelling it out. Well, it's relatively easy for the sighted user to go back if they forget what that acronym or abbreviation means, find where it was spelled out initially, and then jump back to where they were reading. But that can be a lot more difficult for users of assistive technology to back up, find where that abbreviation or acronym was spelled out, and then get back to where they need to be. And so these E tags, or these E entries, allow the normal visual presentation of just the acronym for sighted users, but it provides the full meaning of that through the tag that an assistive technology user can access if they've forgotten what that acronym means. So again, this is not required. It's at level AAA, a best practice, but it is something that's really convenient for users of assistive technologies to better understand acronyms. And then technique 9, providing headings by marking content with heading tags. This is really important. The heading tags need to be not only do the heading tags need to be marked as headings, but they need to be nested correctly without skipping levels as you move down. So you start with heading level 1. Your first heading needs to be heading level 1 for the document. And then your next heading shouldn't be a level 3 heading. It should be a level 2 heading. And then you would use a level 3 heading only under a level 2 heading, and so on. And technique 10, providing labels for interactive form controls. This is another important piece of ensuring users of assistive technology can correctly understand what the form controls are when they're interacting with PDF forms. Technique 11, providing links and link text using the link annotation and the /link structure element. So depending on the original content of the link in the PDF, this could be a level A standard, or this could be a level AAA standard. Sometimes people put just the actual URL in the document, and that's the link. And that link is in context that allows sighted users to understand what that link is for, why they would follow it. But one of the navigation shortcuts that assistive technology users can use for efficiency is navigating by link list. And so they can pull up a list of links in the document, just go from link to link to link. If the link text is just the URL itself, then they're going to miss out on that information explaining what that link is for or why they would follow it. And so that can be confusing. And so these link annotations provide information on what that link is or why they would follow it or both, so that they have the same information about that link that sighted users have. Now, if the link text is already descriptive of the purpose of that link, then the link annotation isn't necessarily required, but it can still be beneficial for users of assistive technology to provide some additional information there. And that's where it would be a level AAA standard. Technique 12, providing name, role, and value information for form fields. This allows the assistive technology to provide information on to the user of assistive technology on how to use the form fields correctly. So again, really important for allowing users of assistive technology to use the forms effectively. Technique 13, providing replacement text using the alt entry for links. This relates to what I explained with links before, providing additional information for users of assistive technology so that they can correctly understand what the links are, even if they're navigating by link list. Technique 14, providing running headers and footers. This is providing the headers and footers themselves. This is level AAA. And so if you, so you're not required to provide information, like a page number on a footer on each page, or a running header that has the document title or the chapter name on each page as you go through the document. Though that's something that can be beneficial for users of assistive technology. And so this is a best practice under level AAA. However, if you provide the running headers and footers, then the format of that does have to be consistent from page to page so that the information is there in the same manner that the person with assistive technology is expecting from page to page. You can't jump around on how you have that information laid out from page 1 to 2 to 3 and so on. Technique 15, providing submit buttons with the submit form action in PDF forms so that once the person has actually filled out the form, they're able to submit that information correctly using the assistive technology and keyboard navigation. And then technique 16, setting the default language using the /lang entry in the document catalog. So screen reader software will read the text out loud to the user, and that software needs to know what language the document is in order to pronounce the words correctly for that user. So it is a requirement that the language be correctly set for the document. So if, for example, if you have a Spanish translation of your documents, then you need to make sure that that is set to Spanish and not English. If your document is in English, then you need to make sure it's set to English versus not being set. Technique 17, specifying consistent page numbering. I don't know if you've ever seen a PDF where if you look at the toolbar at the top of the PDF page, it'll tell you what page of the PDF you're on. But then if you go and look at the pagination on the bottom of each page, maybe the document starts off with an introduction in Roman numerals, and then uh, where the bottom of the page shows page 1 in Arabic numerals, that's actually, page 10 of the document. And so at the top in the toolbar, it says page 10, but at the bottom, it says page 1. And then you're trying to figure out what page you need to jump to find the content you're looking for. That can be confusing. That's particularly challenging for users of assistive technology. And so if you have different page numbering like that at the bottom of the page, that needs to be set to display correctly in that toolbar at the top as well. So that's what technique 17 is describing. Technique 18, specifying the document title using the title entry in the document information dictionary. So there are two parts to this. First of all, does the document have a title attribute that you've specified as a developer or remediator of the document? Ideally, that would be put in the application that was originally used to develop the document. If not, that title can be added in Acrobat Pro. But even if that was already added, by default, a screen reader is going to read the file name rather than the document title. And while that can work depending on what the document was named in the file name, a lot of times we have, false spaces for documents that we upload. So a bunch of extra characters don't get added to the file name, or we put a date in or a version number that's not really part of the document title, or different things like that. Or we have this additional information in the file name in many cases that we don't want read to the assistive technology user. And so we need to tell Acrobat to use the document title and not the file name. So there's two pieces to that. And I will show how that is done as part of the demonstration in session 2, or in part 2. Technique 19, specifying the language for a passage or phrase with the lang entry. So sometimes the primary language of a document is English, but maybe a piece of it is in Spanish or a different language. And so this applies when you have a piece or pieces of the document that are in a language different from the document's primary language. So this would allow the screen reader to know that this particular word or sentence is Spanish, whereas the rest of the document is English, so it can pronounce that Spanish content correctly. Technique 20, using Adobe Acrobat Pro's table editor to repair mistagged tables. This especially applies when there are merged or split cells that have been set up within the original application and then it's converted to PDF. In most cases, those do not get tagged correctly in Acrobat Pro, even if the rest of the table is tagged correctly. And so that's something that specifically needs to be addressed. Technique 21, using list tags for list. This has several benefits. First of all, it allows the assistive technology user to better understand the type of content. The screen reader will typically announce that it's going into a list and it will provide the number of items in the list. This helps better orient the user to the content that's coming. In many cases, assistive technology users can also navigate the document by skipping from list to list to help them find content they're looking for more quickly. And so lists do need to be correctly tagged, and I'll show what that looks like during the demonstration next time. Technique 22, indicating when user input falls outside the required format or values in PDF forms. And so if a date has to be in a particular format in a field, or there's some other restriction on how the information is entered, if a social security number form field has a validation that requires the digits be entered in a particular way with or without the hyphens or anything like that, the form needs to have instructions so that the user of assistive technology can know what's expected, and if they make a mistake, that they're able to identify and correct that and still be able to submit the form. And then finally, technique 23, providing interactive form controls so that assistive technology users and keyboard navigators can correctly navigate the form controls. So those are the 23 PDF techniques that WCAG provides in order to apply the principles in their WCAG standards specifically to PDF documents. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about the PDF UA standards. So whereas the WCAG standards are taking principles and kind of broadly applying them to PDFs, and WCAG doesn't contain the detailed technical standards that fully explain how to know when those principles outlined in WCAG have been achieved. PDF UA provides technical standards written specifically for application to PDFs to help content developers and accessibility remediators know when these accessibility principles have been achieved in PDF documents. Now, because this is not technically part of the WCAG standards, it's from a separate organization, compliance with PDF UA is voluntary for us, even if we're required to comply with WCAG standards at the A and AA level. But in most cases, for most documents I've worked with, the only additional standard or the only additional step to achieving PDF UA compliance over the WCAG standard is identifying a PDF UA tag in the metadata, and that tells technologies and search engines that this particular PDF meets that PDF UA standard. UA stands for Universal Accessibility, by the way. And so it's a pretty simple extra step in most cases that I think is worth taking. It usually just takes an extra minute or so to achieve PDF UA over just the WCAG standards. All right. The next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's preferable in most cases to use PDF documents and not Word documents for accessibility purposes. So when we're comparing PDFs versus Word documents, PDFs are a more accessible format, or a potentially more accessible format in web browsers and just overall. Now, there are some issues with some mobile devices where not all mobile devices are able to fully read and interpret the accessibility tag structure of PDF documents. And so depending on the individual document and the individual mobile device being used, in some cases, a Word document can achieve more accessibility for the end user than if they were using a PDF document for that same content. on that device. But really, that's a limitation of the device itself and not a limitation of the format of the original document. When we're looking just at the accessibility of the original document, the accessibility tagging that's available in PDFs is much more robust than what Word can do. And so um, when accessibility is done correctly, that PDF version of that document is going to have greater accessibility in many cases than if that same document were presented in Word format. And so for that reason, it's preferable to use PDFs for accessibility purposes, especially because uh, as content developers or as remediators, our responsibility is to provide content that is accessible as possible, and we're not responsible for any limitations that result from the particular device that an assistive technology user has on their end. Another advantage of PDFs is that the accessibility or the ability just to open and use the document is independent of the software used to develop the document. Whereas with Word, in many cases, users may need to purchase software in order to open that document. This is becoming less of an issue where the ability to read Word format is being built into more browsers and more devices, even if the person doesn't have Word software. So this isn't as much of an issue as it used to be, but it is still an issue in some cases, and a good reason that it's better to use PDFs. Anytime you're concerned about protecting your presentation of the content from unauthorized edits, this is a case where PDFs provide some additional protections. It's not foolproof. It's not completely secure. There are ways to kind of reverse engineer PDFs and make the content editable, but it's significantly more difficult for someone to go in and make edits to your PDF document that you don't want them doing than if you provide that in a Word document where it, anybody with Word program can pretty much go in and edit that document. And then it's standard practice to post documents to websites in PDF format versus Word format. And so this is another good reason to use PDFs. What I've seen and how I was originally taught to provide document accessibility maybe 15 or 20 years ago was to provide a PDF that had not been remediated for proper accessibility, but then to provide a Word document format as well that wouldn't have the tagging issues of a PDF document that wasn't properly remediated. And that's sort of taking a separate but trying to take a separate but equal approach to accessibility. That's not what we want to do in most cases. There might be rare use cases where that's the only way to make it work, but that's really uncommon. For the most part, we want to be providing people with disabilities, users of assistive technology with an integrated experience, and so we use PDFs for that. Regardless of which format we're using, it requires proper development for the document to be accessible. And so that's kind of one of the trip ups of this idea of using Word for accessibility is it can mislead people into believing that they don't have to follow proper development and remediation steps to make the document accessible. Even with Word, there are things that need to be done to make that accessible. There's often more that needs to be done with PDF, but that's just part of our responsibilities in providing an equal and integrated experience to people with disabilities. All right. Now we're going to talk about automated and manual testing for PDFs. Now, first of all, some differences between automated and manual testing. With automated testing, we're using a tool to scan the entire document or maybe pieces of the document to validate that it's accessible or to flag errors. Whereas with manual testing, a person is checking specific types of content within the document, looking for certain errors that might be there, but that are not machine identifiable. Now, people love automated testing because it's efficient and convenient. But an important limitation is that automated testing is really able to identify less than half of the potential accessibility errors that could exist, which means that even if we're using all of the right automated testing tools and processes, we're still going to need to do manual testing in most cases to ensure that the final product of our document is accessible, that it meets accessibility standards. Automated testing alone is, in most cases, insufficient. The good news is that in some cases, there are tools available to make manual testing easier, and we're going to be looking at one of those tools during the demonstration. Some examples of things that can be tested well using automation: whether the document has a title, whether the document is tagged or not, whether the primary language has been specified or that's missing, whether images have alt text or the alt text is missing, whether headings are nested correctly. If a heading level has been skipped, that can be identified by automated testing. But for many of these, there's a deeper level of compliance that's needed beyond just whether this tag or this title or this feature is there. For example, it's not enough just to have something tagged as a title. That title needs to actually be descriptive, so it's helpful and provides appropriate information to the user. So that's something that needs to be reviewed manually. Even if the document has accessibility tag, it's pretty common for the tag structure or the use of tags to be incorrect at least in parts of the document. And so it's important to understand proper tag structure and make sure the tags are not just there, but that they're used correctly in order for assistive technology users to be able to make sense of the document fully. Is the specified language correct? It's easy enough for a document to be developed in English, translated into Spanish, but then that document language still be set to English. And now the Spanish user is going to have their screen reader pronouncing the words incorrectly because the screen reader thinks the text is English. Is alt text descriptive? Is it providing a true functional equivalent for that assistive tech user as what the sighted user gets out of that image or figure? Are headings identified correctly, and are they descriptive? Is logical reading order correct? Any document that has tags is going to have a reading order, but does that reading order make sense? And then, is color contrast sufficient? The accessibility checker that's built into Acrobat Pro does not check this. Now, we are going to look at another tool that does use automated checking of color contrast, but unfortunately, by the time we get to that point in our process, if we've made a bunch of other fixes and then we find there's a color contrast problem, to fix color contrast correctly and not introduce other problems, we have to go back to our source document in Word or whatever program we originally used to fix the color contrast. And so if we do that later in the process, we're going to have to redo all of the other remediation we've already done. And we've lost a bunch of time if we do that. So color contrast wants to be one of the first things we check to ensure we don't have to go back and redo remediation. All right, so some automated tools that we'll be looking at include the accessibility checker tool in Adobe Acrobat Pro, the PDF accessibility checker, or PAC for short. That's from the PDF UA Foundation. The color contrast analyzer from TPGI is a tool that we can use to help with manual color contrast checking, so we don't need to do a bunch of legwork to figure out the hexadecimal codes for all of the colors and plug those in somewhere to figure out the contrast ratios. And then this is beyond the scope of the demonstrations that are going to be in part 2, but an important part of accessibility testing includes using screen reader software like JAWS, NVDA, or on Mac or iOS devices VoiceOver, or on Android devices TalkBack. So I hope you're able to come back Tuesday, June 6th from 2 to 3 p.m. for the demonstrations of automated and manual testing, where I'm going to be demonstrating how to use these tools. We're going to look at manual checks for title, logical reading order, how to walk the tag tree, and do manual checks for headings and lists. So today I'm going to wrap up by leaving you with a few resources. If you want information on the WCAG standards, you can go to w3.org/wai/standards-guidelines/WCAG. More descriptive content on understanding the WCAG standards is at w3.org/wai/WCAG22/understanding. The WCAG PDF techniques that I covered today can be found at w3.org/tr/WCAG20-TECHS/PDF. The PDF UA standards, also known as the Matterhorn protocol, can be found at pdfa.org/resource/the-Matterhorn-protocol. The tools that I'm going to be demonstrating within Acrobat Pro, the accessibility checker tool can be found by going to Tools and then Accessibility and then Accessibility Check. The PDF UA Foundations PAC checker can be downloaded from pdfua.foundation/en/pdf-accessibility-checker-PAC. And then TPGI's color contrast analyzer can be downloaded from tpgi.com/color-contrast-checker. And then some training resources, LinkedIn Learning for state employees who have this subscription. You can search for the course entitled Creating Accessible PDFs. You can also search for the course entitled Advanced Accessible PDFs. These are much more in-depth trainings that go into significant detail on a lot of PDF remediation techniques that I'm not able to cover in this training. Though this training provides more of a broad overview of the processes that can be harder to glean from the more detailed remediation focus of those trainings. And so this training can be a good place to start before you take those. Now, one thing that those trainings don't cover in as much depth as I would have liked is understanding correct PDF tagging practices. And so for PDF taking practices, I would point you to a resource from Adobe. That site is help.adobe.com/acrobat/using/editing-structure-content-tags.html. All right, we have about 5 minutes left if there are any questions. And if you don't want to contact me or don't want to ask the questions today, you're welcome to contact me at david.kingsbury@dmh.mo.gov for any questions that you'd like to ask me offline, or call me at 573-526-1857. Again, the Deaf Services website is dmh.mo.gov/deaf services. And I will go ahead and open it up for any questions at this